Hello and welcome to this special. A large chunk of private companies in India are family-owned and bound by close ties of community and tradition. But interestingly, the story is pretty much the same across the world. So how does culture define business and the families that run them? And is there a common thread? And that's the question I asked Professor John Davis, who has studied family-run businesses across 60 countries over the last 4 decades.
Culture matters, but it's not a big factor at all. I say it's a 15% factor in its influence on families and businesses. And so, for example, if you take a look at the issues, they're almost identical, going from country to country to country to country. On the other hand, when it comes to implementing an action to address a particular issue, you better pay attention to culture. Because your approach, your ability to challenge authority, or your ability to work with the next generation, those kinds of things, absolutely pay attention to culture. But the issues, no.
My second question, Professor Davis, is what are the common traits that you see?
Here's what we know, big picture. That the family business sector of all economies is the dominant sector. It accounts for about 2/3 of the kinds of the businesses you're going to see in any country. And I don't care whether we're talking about Finland or Argentina or India or wherever, the US. About 2/3 of all the companies are family-owned. There's a big sector of entrepreneurial companies that are started by one person or maybe some unrelated people, etc. And some of those are the big Google types, but a lot of them are the corner bakery. And so that's a big sector as well. And then you've got a tiny, tiny, tiny sector called the publicly traded companies by number. Now, it's a very important sector because these are typically large to giant companies that have a big impact on the economy. But typically half or more of all of the companies that are listed in any country are also family-controlled. So this family-controlled sector is important. Now here's the second kind of surprising aspect, which is that based on a number of studies in a number of countries, family companies perform better than non-family companies. Really?
Right.
Really. And not by this much, but by this much on a number of financial indicators in terms of growth, in terms of returns, in terms of profitability. Family companies perform better. Now there's a little bit of wobble in that comparison, family to non-family business, over generations, but taken as a whole, that's the truth. And so it surprises everybody because there's this notion that family companies are, a bit inferior. They're quaint, they're interesting, they're very traditional, they're probably not going to be very professional. Not true.
How do family-owned businesses change as scale comes into the picture? Because it's easy to have a small company which you can pass on to your son or your daughter. But there are challenges as the company grows and you go into the second and third generation. How does scale determine this?
Well, recognize too that as your business is growing, your family is too. Typically over generations. Families grow. They do this, right? They kind of explode really in the third and fourth generations in terms of size. And so your business actually has to grow in order to keep up with the growth rate of the family. Now, as that company gets bigger, there are some different issues of scale. And as you grow a company, you have to become more and more sophisticated at a bigger scale in terms of running this thing. You can't run it out of your hip pocket anymore. One person typically can't control everything. You've got to delegate, you need systems, etc. And the family has to be acutely not only aware, but supportive of increasing levels of professionalism over time.
We'll talk about that. What is the best practice? But
Yeah.
There's a common saying that the first generation creates a business, the second builds it, and the third squanders it away. Is there any truth in that?
You know, every country has one of these sayings.
Okay.
Every country. I've been in 60 of them or more now. And I always ask, do you have a saying like this? You know, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Oh yeah, we've got one of those. And the presumption, of course, is that it's true, but no one has really tried to challenge it or support it empirically. And I've been working on that for about 3 years. And I find that in general, it is true. Okay?
It is.
It is, yeah. I mean, there are 3 basic paths that families take with their wealth over generations. One is that it goes up, and then it goes down within 3 or 4 generations. That seems to be the predominant path. The second, unfortunately, most common path, is that it goes up, and then it crashes, goes down even faster. And now the first path, the shirt sleeves path, is because generally, you know, you're consuming your assets faster than you're generating them. And the families can consume them with lifestyle expenses and just the fact that there are more family members over time. But businesses also consume assets. And if you don't re-energize, rejuvenate your company by reinvesting aggressively and diversifying appropriately, you're going to find that over time the productivity of those assets are going to go down, especially in today's economic world. But in the crash path, what you find is not only is that going on, but also the family makes a couple of really bad bets and they lose a lot of money. Now the third path is they keep regenerating assets over time, at least up to a certain point, late generation. And in these cases, what we're finding is that they diversify in a timely way, but they also have an interesting diversification pattern where they generally don't what we call bet the ranch on a diversification. They make appropriate, moderate bets, and then the next generation rolls up their sleeves and works it, and they grow again. And that kind of diversification, and what I'm calling the replication of the founder's experience, is what I think works over time. Now, for that to happen, you also need family wealth creators. You need someone in the family to be able to make the bets, or more than one, but they make the bets and they work hard at growing those bets to make them successful.
Building on a legacy is not easy, and family-owned businesses have also drawn criticism for being patriarchal, especially here in India. So is that a big problem?
We're seeing tensions of all kinds, mostly related, interestingly, to the evolution of the family.
Let's focus on India specifically. There are a lot of common strains in the kind of family-owned businesses in India. One is that it's very community-focused. So there are certain communities that dominate the business landscape, and I'm talking about family-run businesses.
Right.
The second is that they're hugely patriarchal. Is that something which is also common elsewhere?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, India's got its own community-based patriarchal system that's part of your culture here. In other countries, it would look a little different, but yeah, these families tend to be very patriarchal. Now, occasionally, which I think is healthy, you're also seeing kind of matriarchal systems. But the point here is that they're strong leadership, where people know that if there's a dispute, or if there's the kind of direction setting, or if we need to mobilize support for something, there's somebody we can turn to who will do that for us. And that is a very healthy thing. You know, over time, what happens with families that tend to not only dissipate their assets, but come apart, is that there's not strong enough leadership to be able to say to the family, hey, listen, fellas, we got to resolve this because we have to work together.
Succession and actually pointedly making a choice of success is one of the biggest challenges.
You bet.
Is it always meritorious? Is merit what determines it? And what role does an independent board or shareholders have, especially in listed companies around the world?
Yeah, perfect question. No, it's not always merit-based. It should be, recognizing that qualified family heirs, meaning that no one's perfect. You even look at Jack Welch. We deify Jack Welch as this great, and he was. But he had his strengths and weaknesses. Every CEO does. So as you're looking for the next leader, they have to be good enough, but they don't have to be like the last one necessarily. They could have a different profile, and they're not going to be great at everything. So they have to be good enough, and if a family heir can get to that point, they usually have a greater capability at mobilizing support of the owners, because the owners feel that he or she is speaking for them. There's something very influential, maybe even magical, about when you're doing business with a company, talking to an owner, as opposed to the professional CEO.
Sure.
And so it's not always meritorious or merit-based. It needs to be, and families have to be. In today's world, they don't have much of a choice. You either select great CEOs, or you're probably not going to drive your company into the future.
Sure. It kind of complicates the matter, Professor, because very often, again, in traditional Indian groups, as the family becomes bigger, not only is the man anointed to be the head of the business, he's also the head of the family. What if the guy you chose is wrong?
Yeah.
And it's so difficult because he's not only the family head but the business head to kick him out of his job.
Well, once somebody is anointed as a family leader, let alone a business leader, it's challenging but also kind of embarrassing to remove him from that role. So, and that's more true in a family business, obviously, than it would be in a non-family business, because family companies are much more sensitive to those kinds of issues and much more loyalty-based. If you're dealing with a non-family CEO in a public company, after 3 or 5 years, if the board doesn't like him, he's gone. And we're going to know it. And there's no sense of long-standing loyalty or no sense of the embarrassment. It's just what we do. But in a family business, to take somebody out, a family member especially, out of a leadership role, it's sensitive. There's a concern, what will this say about the family? What will this communicate within our community about the unity of our family? All kinds of issues. So families have to make good choices. And going back to your point about boards, having a good board help you with the decision. So we know or have a greater sense going into it that we're choosing right.
Let's keep with the fourth, fifth generation kind of big family conglomerate. What are the filters one can use as new generations come in and make their way up, according to you?
The best practices we see out there, and I'm sure you've got some good examples of this too, is to require the next generation to work elsewhere before they come back to the company. Usually 3 to 5 years of outside experience after a university degree. And Minnie, in my experience, it doesn't much matter what the university degree is in. Now, if you're in an engineering company, you might have a strong preference for an engineering degree. But to be honest, I've seen some really good managers, leaders of technical companies who come in with liberal arts degrees. So I think it's the curiosity, the discipline, the sense of inquiry that I think makes a good leader over one's technical training, because you can get a lot of that over time. But university degree, maybe graduate education, we see a lot of families now saying, look, get your university degree, get out there and work for a while, go back for your MBA, and then talk with us. And when you come back in, we're not going to make up a job for you. You have to apply, and we have to think you're good enough. And typically that means, and it should mean, that you're better than non-family employees that we're hiring. Why? Because you're going to be under greater scrutiny. And when you come into the business...
Because of scrutiny and not legacy.
Yeah, yeah. You know, one family likes to say, and I think this is really very important to their kids, they say, be known by your first name, not your last name. Be known by what you can do, not what your family has done before you. And when you come back to this company, you get an edge because of your last name. But we're going to require more from you than we would somebody else in terms of work, in terms of contribution. And if you demonstrate you've got it, you're likely to get further.
That's a good way to ensure the family enterprise doesn't just live on, but grows. But does this come in the way of professionalizing the business? More on that when we return.
If there is a family member who is well qualified, he or she today probably has an edge.
Couple of questions, and this is a very fascinating area because one criticism to this, and the most liberal and the most thought out family charters, have a clause in it which says that youngsters from the family who come into the business are fast tracked to the top. One way of justifying this by a lot of family-owned companies and the patriarchs is that this allows a generational shift in leadership, because this allows a fast track of the younger generation to come in. And most developing and evolving economies like India need that generational shift, because an organization can become very fuddy-duddy, if it is based on the patriarch's thought process. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. Never before in history, I'll say that, but maybe before in history, but the two generations now need to partner more and more. There used to be a sense, not that long ago, the senior generation knew a lot, the junior generation knew less. After many years, they would catch up, and then we could hand off to them. But the junior generation is now walking in with vastly more technological skills, which are important in business, a better sense of the market, because the market is increasingly geared towards younger consumers, and they get it more than we do. And they also tend to be very worldly, very experienced, and comfortable with that. Boundary spanning people that, are comfortable moving across cultures and countries and time zones and so forth. Now, that's very useful. What they don't have as much of is the wisdom that you get over time of seeing this. They don't have as much of that. Now, they get a little bit, but when you've been through several recessions and upticks, et cetera, you learn a little bit more, and you learn a little bit more about people. So,
but that's a perfect situation. But it could be another situation where the third, fourth generation becomes soft. They've been used to the good things in life,
exactly.
And then they become lavish in their lifestyles. They often look at personal, selfish gain, and the dream of the entrepreneur is not there. The dream of creation is not there. That's a huge risk.
Huge risk. Huge. Now, remember, we often blame the next generation for it, but the parents were the ones that cultivated it. They were the ones who gave them a life of ease. They were the ones who sent them to good schools, who gave them what they wanted, and didn't challenge them to stretch themselves and become better. That's typically, not always, but typically the job of the parents. But we can look into that next generation and see it. And when I see it, when I walk into a family, and I see that that's the quality of the next generation, my stomach goes right into a knot, because I know that at best, there's a lot of work to do in this next generation to try to get some of them ready to really contribute to this family.
Professor Davis, the other challenge is what happens in tough times, and we've seen that play out in India, because as you said, in tough times, where especially if you're a listed company, the constraints and the challenges are many. Very often what you've seen is that the stated charters need to be reworked, because we have a case where a patriarch has already, on paper, said that he would retire at this age, move out of the business at that age, and now pretty much all the business looks so tough that it's hard to imagine that succession is anywhere on the horizon or in the mental zone right now?
Very often, families, if they really need the current leader to stay around for a few more years, they'll give an extension. Or the person will just take an extension, which is not as good. And that's always a fallback. But I think, too, that there's a worry that we can't do without the founder. And the very best time for the next generation to really prove themselves is not in good times, but in bad times. The fact that they can step into the breach, that they have their ideas about what to do, and they can turn it around, they can make it better, they can prove themselves. One of the most important things that we can do for our next generation when we're developing them is not to give them good jobs where they're very likely to succeed, but to give them bad jobs that nobody else wants, that really requires that they work double time and that they do the dirty work and that they take something that may fail, but no one else was willing to do it, and that they were willing to demonstrate they know how to make money.
But you know, one issue is that in tough times, investors often have comfort with the patriarch, the person who is the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And is there a tendency to, right away the youngsters and say, let's go with that?
Second generation leaders usually are not like first generation founders. They're not. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to be as successful, even though many of us will doubt them and worry about their capabilities. You know, for example, Bill Marriott Jr. took over from his father, Bill Sr., and Bill Sr. had grown a company in the U.S., Marriott, that was basically a restaurant company that had just gone into hotels and was starting to grow its hotel division. And Bill Jr. took over when the company was about $100 million. His dad didn't think he had it because he wasn't like him. Bill Sr. was this charismatic entrepreneurial guy that people adored, and Bill Jr. was the organization man. He really understood how to make operations really work. And he took over at $100 million. So an outside advisor actually convinced the father, your son's what we need. Bill Jr. takes over and grows the company to $8 billion. It's not bad. From $100 million to $8 billion. The next generation will be different, and normally we need something different.
Last question.
Yeah.
You've studied so many companies across 60 countries. You're doing a lot of work and starting to do a lot of work around India. Is there a set of best practices that families can adopt to ensure both longevity of their business and the family together, or the interests of the family, and the ability to grow?
What we know about family business is that over time, businesses come and go. You know, the business, or you may have 3 or 4 businesses today, there's a life cycle to these businesses, and they will come and go. And you have to renew them, or sell them, or diminish their importance and get into new businesses over time. But if families do, business families can stay in business for a long time, many generations. But they have to have that flexibility in terms of managing their portfolio and understanding how to grow businesses and how to sell them at the right time or change what they do. Okay? There also needs to be a lot of challenging development of the next generation. Now, as families grow, the family talent pool is typically bigger. But in that talent pool, you've got to keep them interested in business. And not all of them will be, obviously. You're going to have school teachers and artists and stay-at-home moms and et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. But you better have some people in that next generation that you can challenge and get into your current company, develop as entrepreneurs. And then finally, number 3, you've got to be working on family unity. And family unity over time is a precious thing, but it's also pretty difficult to maintain.
Next week, we look at another dominant player in business, the state, and why many government-owned enterprises are struggling here in India.